Hi, everyone. Our speaker today is Sharon Coward, Executive Director of EnviroCentre, who will speak to us about the path to Canada's future homes. Before I turn it over to Sharon, I'd like to give you a little background about the history of EnviroCentre. In 1991, an initiative called Green Communities was established by Bob Rae's new NDP government in Ontario for the purpose of promoting the development of community enterprises in the business of promoting environmental action. In 1994, then supported by the major government funding, EnviroCentre was launched in Ottawa as Ottawa's entry to drive the Green Home Visit program, a core service of green communities. The program met with moderate success, but other than sending trained students into homes to do energy audits and make recommendations, little else was achieved. One of the problems, because I was observing it at the time, was that they'd hired a whole lot of bright young students, but they hadn't created the service. However, what happened was government funding was pulled in late 1995 and EnviroCentre shut its doors. However, there was a group of interested citizens and local businesses and organizations, including the City of Ottawa, the regional municipality, Hydro Ottawa, Consumers Gas, and others who believed the vision of green communities, and discussions took place on developing a not-for-profit business that would move the vision forward without depending on government handouts. In mid-1997, I was asked by the city's environmental management branch if I would be interested in developing a strategic framework and initial business plan for a new Ottawa Green Community Initiative. The report, and here it is, was tabled in spring 1998 and included a detailed business planning and operational framework model and a financial planning model. The strategy was to start a not-for-profit business that would market environmental products and services to homeowners, businesses, and governments without relying on government handouts. The name EnviroCentre was chosen for the new enterprise. An executive director was hired, and EnviroCentre began operations in January 1999. The mayor at the time in Ottawa, Bob Chiarelli, wanted some visibility for the initiative, so he agreed that EnviroCentre's office and storefront should be in City Hall, where it remained for several years before purchasing its own office and storefront on Rideau Street. Over the intervening years, EnviroCentre's product and service offerings have evolved, and it's become a very successful not-for-profit business with a variety of offerings consistent with the original vision of green home communities. If you're not familiar with EnviroCentre, Google on EnviroCentre Ottawa, go to the website, you'll be amazed at what you learn. Initiatives are listed under green homes, green business, green transportation, and green lifestyle. You can even sign up for a daily tip email called My Green Lifestyle. Sharon Coward was hired as EnviroCentre's Executive Director in 2017. She holds an interdisciplinary degree in community development and health with a focus on international development and Indigenous studies. Before joining EnviroCentre, Sharon worked for 10 years in the community health and social services sector and has an enduring interest in community development, having worked in 4 countries on 3 continents. Sharon has a keen interest in the intersection of energy policy and sustainable development and the practical implications of each for our local communities and for future generations. She's an Ottawa native, is committed to supporting local initiatives working toward a collaborative vision for a sustainable national capital region. In my opinion, Sharon's done a superb job since joining EnviroCentre, and she will now tell us about the path to Canada's future homes. Over to you, Sharon.
Thank you so much, Paul. That was an amazing introduction. So I just want to thank everybody for having me here today. It's really great to be here with the Canadian Association for the Club of Rome. Your work is, Club of Rome obviously is known the world over, and so it's nice to be here. I was looking on your website and noted that your mission, part of your mission, is to encourage a systematic and integrated approach to issues and their solutions, and I think it's a great fit for today's talk. So I just want to start by acknowledging that I am speaking from unceded Algonquin territory, and I'm very grateful to be here, and I'm grateful for all the people that have cared for this land for thousands of years before us. So we're going to talk today a little bit about the path to Canada's future homes. And so that's going to involve first looking a little bit into why residential retrofits are an important part of Canada's path to zero emissions. And then we're going to move forward and look at what's involved in the enormous project of retrofitting Canadian homes. And then we're going to delve a little bit into what we're actually doing here in Ottawa to start us on this path and some of the work that EnviroCentre is looking into. So I think Paul gave a great summary of what EnviroCentre is, but as he says, I'm Sharon. I'm the Executive Director of EnviroCentre. We are a nonprofit organization located in Ottawa, and our work basically focuses on helping people reduce GHG emissions. And so we work with residents, with businesses, with communities to point them towards practical solutions to reduce their environmental impact. And Paul did highlight our main focus areas. We work in green homes, green transportation, green lifestyles, and green business. Obviously, today our focus is going to be on green homes. EnviroCentre has a long and illustrious history in green homes and home energy efficiency. So right from the beginning, more than 20 years ago, where we did have that storefront, we were selling high efficiency light bulbs and low flow toilets when they were actually really hard to come by. And then moving into the present, where we focus on energy audits, home assessments, and planning retrofits and actually doing retrofits for homes. We also have a wide range of other programs, but that's what we do on the home energy efficiency side. All right, so let's dive into the question at hand. So why are residential emissions reductions important? So there's a number of answers to this question, but I'm going to start with the obvious. Here in Canada, about 12% of our annual emissions come from the built environment. And while that isn't an enormous proportion, it's important to understand that we are all working towards zero emissions in 2050. So everything matters, and we need to start engaging today. We actually needed to start engaging 25 years ago in really getting these emissions in hand. So this is a breakdown of Canada's greenhouse gas emissions by economic sector. And you can see that little green slice on the left-hand side is building emissions. That's 12%. And obviously there are some bigger slices, but what's important to consider when you're looking at where to put your energies in reducing emissions and where to start is what's actually feasible in the country that you're in and the situation that you're in. And so one of the things about building retrofits and energy efficiency is that there's very little political opposition. So just to put that in context, we have the technology, the knowledge to really get our emissions under control in most of the sectors that we're looking at. We also arguably have the financial resources. There are lots of strong economic cases for taking action on climate and reducing emissions. What we don't have is the political and social support. And so those are really the key barriers to getting some of this work done. And so when you look at a really big emissions area like oil and gas is a really good example, sometimes the political opposition and also the complexity of dealing with parts of the economy that involve international agreements put up some real barriers to action. And we've seen that over the years, the last 30 years of trying to move forward in these areas and have global agreements. It's very challenging. Whereas some areas like residential retrofits, to some extent transportation, we really have a lot of control over what we do in those areas within our country, within our province, within our city even. And in some of these areas, including energy efficiency, there isn't very much political opposition. You don't see a political party leader coming out and just getting furious at the policies of their opponent and saying how energy efficiency is losing us jobs, because it just isn't the case. There's a clear public benefit to energy efficiency. There's a clear economic benefit. And also importantly, there are a lot of local benefits to energy efficiency and specifically building retrofits. And that's important because a lot of the work that actually happens on the ground and where we engage with people making changes and taking action in their own lives, that often happens locally. It happens at the municipal level. And what's interesting about that is that this is the same chart as before, looking at the building emissions, 12% for Canada. But when you drill down to the municipal level, the proportions change. And that's because the economic sectors that are present here in Ottawa and a lot of cities are a little bit different. So using Ottawa as an example, here in Ottawa, building emissions are responsible for about 45% of our local emissions. And about half of that is residential building emissions. And so that means that residential emissions essentially make up a quarter of the emissions in Ottawa. And so that's a really significant piece and really a priority for our local region. So that's just a brief investigation of the need and why we would be looking at residential retrofits, why it's a good bet. So now we're going to look a bit into the project itself, what's involved in retrofitting Canadian homes. So I'm going to use Ottawa as an example again. Obviously, I'm from Ottawa, and obviously Ottawa is the center of the world, but also Ottawa is a good example of a Canadian municipality. So what applies here in Ottawa applies in a lot of other places. So here in Ottawa, our emissions reduction target is 0 emissions by 2050, and the majority of those emissions reductions need to take place by 2040. So the City of Ottawa estimates that in order to reach those targets, our residential existing buildings here in town must be retrofit for 70% heating savings and 30% electrical savings at a rate of 27% of buildings by 2030 and 98% by 2040. Part of that project means that 20% of residential roofs must have solar PV by 2050. And, that sounds pretty achievable. 560,000 residential heat pumps must be installed by 2040. So that project's starting to look a little bit bigger, maybe a little bit more challenging. I'm just going to dig into these numbers again. 27% of residential buildings in town need to be retrofit by 2030. That's in 8.5 years. 98% of buildings need to be retrofit by 2040. That's 327,000 single family units here in town. It's almost 20,000 homes retrofit per year. So that scale of work does not happen overnight. It is a huge task, and we're starting from almost 0. It's an enormous project, and then when you scale it up to, Ontario, Canada, in Ontario, that means about 74,000 homes retrofit a year, and that's just 2% a year. So why would we take on this incredibly challenging project? And so we've already discussed the climate reasons to take it on. We need to take this on in order to hit our emissions reduction targets. But fortunately, there are actually some other really good reasons to take on this project. Energy use in buildings here in Canada is an enormous cost to citizens annually. So in Ontario, we spend about $25 billion annually on energy. That breaks down to about $4,700 per household per year. Here in Ottawa, it's a little bit different. It's about $3,200 per household per year, but it's still a lot of money. And most of that energy spending does not stay in the local community. So you might ask yourself, well, why does that matter? So the federal government, the provincial government, the municipal government, and also folks on the ground here in town really care about local business and the local economy. That is a real indicator of the satisfaction of the people, the health of the economy. And especially now, after 1.5 years of pandemic, we are all pretty worried about our local businesses and really focusing on local economy, supporting businesses. So let's put that in perspective. Here in Ottawa, 95% of our annual energy spending leaves the city. So our annual spending is around $3 billion. Less than 5% of that energy is produced locally. So that means that less than 5% of that $3 billion is going to local Ottawa businesses. So what improving energy efficiency does with respect to that is you reduce the amount of money that households are spending on energy, and that money can go elsewhere. And household spending, for the most part, with the exception of energy, does stay in the local community. Another real asset to this type of work for local communities is that energy retrofits create local jobs that can't be outsourced. So even if a household was spending all of that energy savings on their retrofit, which I'll get into a bit more later, is a possibility. So let's say that you spend $10,000 retrofitting your home, and all of that money goes into the retrofit. You get that money back in energy savings, but there's no extra. That money is still going into the local economy because you can't hire someone in Japan to retrofit your home. You have to hire someone locally. There are also other benefits. So we've looked at quite a few of the municipal ones. There are some other benefits. So municipalities understand that improved properties mean increased property taxes, and so they appreciate that. Energy efficiency and home energy efficiency also reduces demands on our energy infrastructure, and energy infrastructure is very expensive to build, so that's a real asset. We've already mentioned keeping energy dollars local. Another benefit for municipalities is it allows municipalities to demonstrate their local climate leadership, and that hasn't always been a great calling card for municipalities, but right now it is increasingly becoming one. And then we can take a look at homeowners, some of the benefits there. Obviously, saving money on energy is a positive thing for homeowners, but there are other things. So a well retrofit home is more comfortable. The indoor air quality is much better. And here in Canada, we spend around 90% of our time indoors. So indoor air quality is important, and it is a real health indicator. Retrofits can also increase property value. They reduce a homeowner's vulnerability to energy price fluctuations, and that just makes sense. If you're using less energy, you're less worried about a sudden spike in the price. And then really importantly, homes that are deep retrofit for energy efficiency are more resilient homes. And that's something that is increasingly on the mind of the average person of our population. So as we move into an era of climate change, of bigger storms, we're concerned about that. And an energy efficient home reduces some of that risk. So if we're seeing increased storms and power failures, we're not as much at risk in our very energy efficient home that keeps the heat in, keeps the cool in. So these are real benefits that people appreciate. So that was the case in short for retrofits. There's a lot more to say around that, but that's the précis case. So now we're going to take a look at how you actually reduce building emissions. So what are we talking about in this project? So the way that you can look at that is look at how energy is used in the residential sector, because that energy is what's producing the emissions, and that is the vast bulk of the emissions produced from the energy sector. And it's actually pretty simple. So here in Canada, the vast majority of our residential energy goes to space heating and cooling, which probably doesn't surprise anybody. The second highest portion is to water heating, which sometimes is a surprise. So you can see in this pie chart, the dark blue section is space heating. The bigger chunk that's light blue, that's the water heating. There's another little sliver there that's light blue that is space cooling. Often we lump that together and just say that it's heating and cooling our indoor space. So we often spend a lot of attention or give a lot of attention to reducing or improving our efficiency in our appliances and our lighting. And this is a very positive thing. But as you can see, really, if you're looking at deep emissions reduction, you want to be looking at space heating and water heating. Just pulling that back into Ottawa for a little bit of context, the Ottawa context does play out that national statistic and pie chart. So in Ottawa, about 60% of residential energy use is space heating, 22% is water heating. And then some other interesting numbers, 20% of building heat loss is through walls in buildings in Ottawa, and 25% is through doors and windows. And this is important because remember, we've just demonstrated that really the emissions savings and the energy savings are in the heating and cooling of the home. So a big factor there is how much of that is getting out and how much can we stop getting out so we can improve our energy efficiency. There are basically three, and I'm going to call them simple steps to decarbonize buildings, and they are in themselves quite simple. So the first one is you make the building really, really efficient. You reduce the amount of energy required to run that building. The second is that you electrify everything in that building. So we might dig into that a little bit more later, but essentially the reason that we're moving towards electrifying everything is that it's not possible to remove the emissions from a fossil fuel furnace. So for instance, a gas furnace, you can't remove those emissions. You can make it really, really efficient, but you can't bring it down to zero. Now, while our electricity in different parts of the country is not 100% clean or renewable at this point, it can be. And so if you're moving things over to electricity, you have the capacity to move all of that power to clean energy sources, which feeds into number 3, which is decarbonize the electricity supply. And obviously, arguably, these could be switched around. It might be more important to decarbonize the electricity supply first, but these 3 things have to happen. So specifically, when we're looking at residential buildings, what does that mean? So the first one, make the building efficient. So I'm going to bring you back again to what the big source of emissions and energy use is in our residential buildings, space heating and cooling. And so the single biggest thing that we can do in our buildings, the most important one, is to improve the envelope. And so that's exactly what it sounds like. It's the outside of the building. Ways to improve the envelope include improving attic, wall, basement insulation, sometimes adding exterior cladding if it's not convenient or efficient to do it on an interior basis, replacing windows and doors with high efficiency versions, air sealing, other types of deep retrofits. So that's the biggest thing that we want to address. And the second one, electrify everything. Again, bringing our attention back to space heating. So we do want to electrify everything, but our priority is to electrify our heating system. And so that's where that 560,000 heat pump installations come from. So really high efficiency electric heating. There are other versions, but that's a really common one. That's what's been identified for Ottawa. So really just for switching that out. And then of course, secondarily, switching out your water heaters for electric versions, and then everything else, thermostats and controls, drain water heat recovery systems, so making the best possible use of the energy that you're using, moving everything to electric. And then finally, the third one, decarbonizing electricity supply. Now, that obviously is not the main purview of homeowners. So that's an energy infrastructure project. However, it has been identified here in Ottawa and in many other cities that homes can contribute to adding that clean energy to the grid by adding, in the case of Ottawa, solar PV and energy storage to their homes. So that's part of the picture. And we know how to do all of this stuff. And in fact, there are a number of people who have done it, who have provided demonstration projects. And I would imagine some of this group, if you have interest in this area, you've seen some of those example projects. You know, a home in Calgary where apparently it snows every month of the year that requires just the tiniest amount of energy to stay heated, even going down to -30. So a question there is, why aren't we all doing this? Why haven't we scaled these retrofits? Why aren't we already there? There are a lot of answers to that question. And here in Ottawa and across the country, many professionals have been delving deeply into this at a serious rate for the last decade and certainly the last 5 years. So one answer to that question, and I'll go into some other ones, is that residential retrofits are homeowner driven. So we're talking about a private owner of a property who has to decide that this is the best use of their money. And it's not this is one of the factors that I'll talk about here, it's not a exciting prospect. So energy efficiency is invisible. You can see the granite counter that you pay to install in your kitchen, and you can see the deck that you build outside. You can't see energy efficiency, and so that really affects its popularity and the ability to understand it. Retrofits are expensive. Energy retrofits are expensive. They have high upfront costs, you know, 20,000 plus, and energy in many parts of the country, particularly in Ontario, natural gas is very cheap. There's not a lot of financial incentive to do it. As a result, and of some other factors, there can be extended payback periods. So usually the cost case for doing a retrofit is that you do an investment up front, but the amount that you save gradually over the years pays you back. And that is true, but sometimes the payback periods are as long as 10 or 15 years. And in Ontario, the general tenure of homes, the amount of time that we live in our homes is more like 5 to 8 years. And so making that investment goes beyond what you're actually going to receive back in energy savings. Another factor is that retrofits are confusing and hard to plan. Energy retrofits, you have to know what you're doing, and you have to have professionals who also know what they're doing. You can make mistakes that actually really seriously detract from the efficiency of your home and all the money that you've poured into it. And so homeowners kind of shy away from that for good reason. There are split incentives. So if you're a landlord and you own a home, you're going to have to pay for that retrofit to make the home energy efficient, and then your tenants will get the benefit in many cases of reduced utility costs. And so there's no incentive for you to do that. And then of course there's all the challenges that are present in any retrofit. So I hope that you can't hear the drilling that's going on outside my house, but I'm having a deck built, and I'm very lucky because it's really hard to find contractors right now to do anything. Work is often delayed, it's an inconvenience. And then when you go into looking at energy retrofits, it's even more so. There's a limited number of trained contractors who have a great understanding of how this stuff works. And same goes for registered energy advisors. That's something the government is looking at and addressing right now, but its availability has been a bit of a challenge. All of those factors that I just talked about, they apply to any energy retrofit. But what we're actually talking about here is a deep retrofit. So remember, if you harken back to the earliest slide, we're looking for a 70% heating savings, thermal savings, and a 30% electricity savings. That is what's called a deep retrofit. And to get there, you have to go further, as you can well imagine. By some estimates, deep retrofits are estimated to be as much as $100,000 per home for a single detached home. Now, there's a lot of range in the estimates. There are some examples where you can actually have a very cost-effective retrofit, but generally speaking, it's quite a lot of money and it falls outside what folks are usually willing to do. So just to summarize, why aren't we doing this? Why isn't it taken off the world over? It's expensive. There's an extended payback period. The process is quite confusing and it's actually quite hard to coordinate. So I'm not making the case against doing retrofits, but I'm just outlining for you that right now, this current moment in history, our economy, our sort of ecosystem of supports does not yet support serious demand for scaled retrofits. Now, if you spend any time in circles where folks are talking about retrofits, that's what you hear all the time. We need to scale, we need to scale, we need to go to mass retrofits, we have to have impact. That is true, but we need to have certain things in place in order to make that happen. And right now, some of these things are missing. So for instance, a homeowner does not have, if they want to engage in this type of retrofit, simple, trusted tools to navigate a deep retrofit. If you wanted to get into a deep retrofit today, you'd have to do some serious research and it wouldn't be the most simple process. As I mentioned before, the cost benefit of a deep retrofit is not, generally speaking, good enough to incentivize the average homeowner to action, even with the emerging incentives. And so it's an exciting time in retrofits right now. There is attention to retrofits. The federal government is just about to launch the Greener Homes program, which will provide $5,000 of incentives and free audits to a certain number of homeowners. The City of Ottawa is just about to launch the Better Homes Loan program, which will provide low-cost financing attached to the home itself. There are provincial incentives. There's a lot of movement. But even with all of those things, arguably it's not enough. It's still not enough to incentivize an average person who doesn't have a real vested interest to take the next step. Another barrier is that homeowner knowledge of energy retrofits, and in particular low carbon retrofits, so retrofits that are looking to reduce emissions, is very low. Example projects are few and generally unrelatable. So I often get some pushback around this one with folks saying, they're examples. My house is an example. This is true. There's some really great, exciting examples. The trouble is that many of those examples are not easily replicable. So if I'm a person who lives in Centretown or Vanier or Old Ottawa South or a neighborhood in another city, and I live in a particular type of home, it's small, I don't have a lot of money, but I do want to retrofit my home to net zero, I can't necessarily relate to the cutting edge example projects that I see online because they're too expensive and they're too cutting edge. I need a simple, practical solution, and ideally in my neighborhood. Positive outcomes of these retrofits are not guaranteed, and I alluded to that a little bit earlier, that if you do things in the wrong order when you're doing a home retrofit, or you have a contractor that doesn't understand the different stages in the process, you can eliminate the majority of your savings, and it can be very expensive, and obviously that's a risk that folks don't want to take. And of course, as I mentioned, contractors and equipment are hard to find. And overall, this approach still feels really fringe to the average resident. So we talk about this a lot at EnviroCentre. We're all very invested in this. Many of us have not retrofitted our homes because even for us, we're still in a bit of an early adopter phase. People don't understand it to the extent that you're like, oh yeah, my 3 neighbors have done this. Of course, it's a good plan. So when we talk about trying to build a retrofit economy that can support us actually moving to this net zero future, this is some of what we're talking about. So this little green person right here, this is a green professional. So this is me, and this is other folks that are working in the field. And all these clouds, this is the ecosystem of things that we're thinking about and we're trying to pull together to make it possible to do scaled retrofits. And so there's a lot of things in there. We're looking at revising the building code, working with the municipality and utility companies, working with realtors, scaling up auditors, looking at the different kinds of certifications for trades and also for the homes themselves. And so we're trying to pull all of this stuff together, and we're not there yet, but we're working on it. And then this little blue person, this is the homeowner. And there's a whole constellation of factors circling around the homeowner as well, but they're different factors. And so the homeowner is thinking about cost. They're thinking about the inconvenience of doing an audit. They may be thinking about the payback period. They may be worried about these weird random technologies that they're going to have to employ that they don't understand. They're probably thinking about competing priorities because this is probably not the only thing that they have to deal with this week or this month. All of these things are related to the earlier screen, but they're not quite the same things. So in order to move us forward to a situation where we can even start to think about scaling retrofits to 20,000 a year or beyond just in the Ottawa area, we need to build the components of this system. This is the one that the green professionals are looking at. And we need to create the supports that meet the needs of this system for the homeowner. So essentially building this system builds the ecosystem for the regional retrofit economy. And then building this system supports demand in homeowners. And these are both really important things, and we can't have a successful retrofit economy without both. So we're going to take a look now at how all of this might happen, because what I'm trying to emphasize in this presentation is while we have great ambitions, we have great technology, we have a lot of motivation, we're still pretty far away from actually being at a place where we can scale this type of action. So I'm going to bring you back into Ottawa, and I'm going to go a little Kim Stanley Robinson on you and envision a possible future. This is grounded in Ottawa, but it could apply across the country, and it does expand out. So this reflects the problem that we're looking at of we need to meet our targets, we need to rapidly accelerate the number of retrofits that are happening, but actually we're here in 2021, and we don't have control over all the components of the system that need to be in place. So for instance, here in Ottawa, we can influence, but we can't decide that the federal government is going to start a funding program that supports these retrofits. We can't decide unilaterally that there's going to be, forgivable loans or zero interest loans, which do sound like they're coming down the pipeline, but we can't make those decisions. However, when those things are in place and suddenly there is funding support and people have a real reason to jump into doing this work, we also can't go from 0 to 20,000 retrofits a year. We need to build up our capacity gradually. So the case that I'm making in this presentation and have made in the pilot project that we're doing is that what we can be doing on the ground today is building out that capacity. So I'm going to give you some of the rationale. So today, 2021, what can we do actually this year? So in 2021, the groundwork is laid for local financing support, for system navigation, for contractor trainings, for neighborhood engagement strategies that build some of that awareness, for cross-sectoral collaborative planning. And so that means building up the capacity to work with contracting partners, planning partners to actually get these projects happening smoothly, advocacy approaches, and building up local deep retrofit demonstration projects. So that's 2021. That's very feasible. That's actually what we're going to be doing this year. 2022, moving forward. So federal funding supports catalyze a major uptick in EnerGuide audits with stepped net zero recommendations. This is actually quite likely to happen. 6 neighborhood demonstration projects, and in this case, we're looking at Ottawa, are completed with outreach campaigns. So we're expanding that knowledge. 4 additional neighborhoods are engaged. Funding is procured for a 50-home regional retrofit project. A certification standard is established for local contractors, and funding is procured for contractor training support. I would say this stuff all falls in the range of this may well happen, and we hope that it does. So moving into 2023, coming a little bit more fictional. The city adopts a retrofit code with net zero requirements. The Better Homes Ottawa program is expanded to include concierge and planning services for homeowners, supported by federal funding. This is definitely a dream. A citywide communications campaign improves local awareness of deep retrofits by 40%. Requests for Better Homes loans double. Trades training sees increased demand. Regional procurement agreements are reached with local manufacturers and suppliers, so supporting that local economy. Moving forward again into 2024, the Ottawa Future Home 50-home pilot rolls out in partnership with 4 other Ontario municipalities. Public support for home labeling, energy labeling, reaches an all-time peak thanks to some of this communications work that's been happening, and disclosures on real estate listings become commonplace. The Better Homes loan program increases the forgivable portion of loans. There are no forgivable portions right now, but again, fiction, with support from a new federal government initiative. And moving into 2025, and this is where we start to move into the range of a situation where we could scale retrofits. In response to widespread public support and emerging research on the climate emergency, the federal government launches the Canada Home Energy Program, supporting net zero retrofits across the country as a public infrastructure project. A mass retrofit industry is born and is built in our local municipality and in other municipalities on the work that's been done in the previous years. This is where we are today. And so this is the beginning of that project, and the case that we're making as an environmental organization and in the city is that we really do need to get moving, and we need to get some of these things in place to be ready for the time that we hope is coming when these retrofits will become more commonplace. And so here in Ottawa, EnviroCentre, in partnership with the Ottawa Energy Collective and funded by the Ottawa Climate Action Fund, is in fact starting that project. We have a pilot project that is starting this month called the Ottawa Future Home Project. And so that project is going to start engaging in some of these areas. So we're going to start developing and testing household engagement strategies in 2 targeted neighborhoods around deep retrofits, including testing the effectiveness of neighborhood demonstration projects to increase the uptake of home energy audits and retrofits, which we can do today. And we're going to accompany the selected neighborhoods through the whole journey from laying the groundwork for an effective project to its actual implementation. This is possible in Ottawa because there's been a lot of planning work going into it already. So all of these partners, so you see the Ottawa Energy Collective, you see Hydro Ottawa, Energy Evolution, which is a City of Ottawa planning project, a lot of the other partners. We've all been working together for nearly a decade to create some of these plans. And essentially there is agreement on what needs to be done. There just needs to be work on actually making that happen. And so we're trying to contribute to a piece of that. And I just want to remind again, our project envisions this whole project rolling out in phases. We're in the development phase right now. Phase 2 would be implementation, actually procuring more funding to do small scale projects like that 50 home level project. Phase 3 takes us beyond what I feel would be possible today. And it moves us into the phase where we're looking at some game-changing approaches to financing these retrofits. And by phase 3, it's not going to be an EnviroCentre project. That would be the entire region and everybody working together to do some of this work. So just digging a little bit more into what our approach is there in the phase 1, we're going to be looking at engaging communities. We're going to be looking at building capacity in contractors, in potentially, if we need, in architects, planning firms, to build up that capacity to work together and do these projects, starting pretty small, because we haven't done a lot of them in that way here in Ottawa. Laying the groundwork for the actual demonstration projects, because again, I'm going to bring you back to which I'm sure you all understand as you're probably all homeowners. This isn't a public project that you can go out and just say, okay, we're going to retrofit your home, and yours is a good model. You have to get buy-in, and you have to get really serious engagement on the ground from homeowners, from the neighborhood, to make this work. And so it requires a significant amount of investment on the ground in getting to know neighborhoods, getting to know people. And then at this stage of the process, we're also going to resource phase 2, because as I've alluded to, the incentives that are out there right now today are not really enough to carry off a net zero retrofit in most contexts, with a cost case that is inspiring to the homeowner. And so we're going to try to help with that by resourcing these particular projects. And then when we move into phase 2, our vision is that we would implement those projects. We continue to grow regional capacity, and so that means a lot of trades training, working with schools to both build up programs and also build up interest in the programs. We're going to scale the communications approaches that we've already tested, the ones that worked, and move forward. And then moving to phase 3, it's basically applying everything we've learned and expanding what works when the supports are in place to make it possible. So essentially, this project is looking at engaging the community, doing a number of assessments, because that is something that we can do today. So looking at home assessments with net zero retrofit recommendations, spending some time recruiting and building that support on the ground, and then preparing for phase 2. And all of this is going to happen because we want to create these project outcomes. And I'll go a little bit into why we want to do that. So coming out of this project, we should have a set of residents' needs profiles for a range of residential scenarios in our 2 selected communities. And the reason that that's important is, as you can see, we have a good idea of what some of the obstacles are to moving forward in residential retrofits, but we don't know everyone's situation. There are a lot of different situations in the community. So we want to build up that knowledge so that when we're looking at ways to reduce barriers, we're looking at the right barriers, and we're looking at barriers for folks that maybe we don't know, or communities that we don't know very well. We're going to be building up a communications strategy to push forward that knowledge and awareness, and a communications tool package that will be applicable to all of Ottawa, but also something that we can share with other municipalities, because this work is really happening in partnership, certainly across Ontario and across Canada. We'll have built out a Better Homes Ottawa site modeled after the Better Homes Toronto site, and providing a good resource of tools so people can go to one place to find information. We'll actually be developing a supplementary net zero audit component and report with a stepped recommendations format. And we'll be building up, as I've discussed, the buy-in from the neighborhood stakeholders. We'll be doing a set of assessments so people are getting used to what that looks like and what some of the recommendations are, and then planning for the second stage project. So building out detailed retrofit plans and feasibility plans and funding proposals in order to support the next steps, and of course evaluating everything that we do as we go along. We're doing all this stuff to respond to the obstacles that I identified earlier in the project, and that's in order to get us as far ahead as we can in the movement towards building a successful retrofit economy. So to respond to the fact that homeowners don't have simple, trusted tools, we're going to build the Better Homes Ottawa site and provide these tools. And the great thing about this work is that's based on an open source model. So when we build that, any city or township can take that information and build the same thing again, and that's what we want to encourage. So to address the issue of the cost benefit of a deep retrofit, we can't address that systemically. So we don't have the capacity to address that for all the residents of Ottawa, but what we can do is address that for these key demonstration projects that will show Ottawa residents what's possible and reassure them that it can be done. And so we're going to procure funding to do that. To address homeowner knowledge of energy retrofits, and particularly low carbon retrofits, as you've heard, the whole outreach component of this project, in partnership with the city and with community leaders, is to bring this knowledge mainstream using a local approach. To respond to the example projects being few and unrelatable, these demonstration projects will be as close as around the block, done for your neighbor, and completely applicable to your home type. To address the issue of positive outcomes not being guaranteed, we bring EnviroCentre's expertise in project planning and technical support that will significantly reduce that risk. And we hope to see that scaled so that we can roll that out beyond this project. In terms of addressing the fact that contractors and equipment are hard to find, in the immediate, we're going to help the participating homeowners to actually book those contractors and potentially arranging for equipment. But then, of course, in the background of this project, we're working on building capacity so that becomes less and less the case. And then, of course, the overall issue of this approach still feeling kind of fringe to the average resident. So the driving force behind this project is to grow the public profile of deep retrofits, endorsed by the city and by community leaders and champions, as well as participating neighbors, so that it becomes a much safer bet. So essentially what we're doing in this phase one of the project is building this real homeowner demand. So trying to answer these questions and allow that demand and interest to build up. And it's going to bring us back to this path to the future, because obviously this project isn't in some ways as ambitious as exciting as we'd like to see, because it's really just laying the groundwork. But it's really important that we do that, because this has proved incredibly hard nut to crack, to actually get these retrofits going, to move to mass retrofits. And so with all of our partners in the city, we're looking at taking a measured approach and getting ourselves there in a long-term planning fashion. Because you can't get to zero emissions in a jump. We can't jump to step 5 there to 2025. But we do desperately need to get moving on anything that we can do in steps 1, 2, and 3. And so one perspective there is that for many years, we've been in the industry looking at this and saying, no, there's obstacles. Let's identify the obstacles, and we can't do it. And it's true, there have been all these obstacles. But we feel that we really need to dive in now and say, okay, there are obstacles, but there are also things we can do to get moving, because this project is enormous. There are 3.7 million single family homes in Ontario, not to speak of the rest of the country. Retrofitting those homes is an enormous project. I mentioned earlier the 74,000 homes a year, and that's actually just getting 60% of Ontario homes efficient by 2050. So to meet that zero emissions target, it would be even more ambitious. So just the last thing that I'm going to talk about is what folks on this call and folks in the community can do and can think about in terms of building this initiative and moving towards our net zero future. So obviously the building awareness. Now that isn't something that average citizens can 100% do. I've cited the anti-litter campaign. Another great example is the anti-smoking campaign, where governments really got on board and there was all kinds of marketing and communications. As average citizens, we can't do that, but what we can do is encourage the government to go in that direction at all levels. And we can also start talking amongst our friends and family, because actually that is the biggest way that people start feeling comfortable in investing in new approaches and technologies. It may be that in your roles in life or in the folks that you know in the community, you can contribute to building the local economy. So that means that we need to build the capacity and have trained professionals ready to go to roll out what is going to be a massive work project. And so that means, as I've mentioned, working with schools to develop programs, but also to encourage young people to go into this field of work and ensure that it is a good job. And I realize people on this call probably are not actually working, some of you maybe, but are not necessarily working in those fields, but you might be, or you might know someone that is, and kind of tap that interest in that area. A big one that we all can do is pushing for government support. And so I've spoken briefly about taking the angle of approaching home retrofits as energy infrastructure. Now, it remains to be seen if that's the approach that we're actually going to take in Canada. But what that means is energy infrastructure is an expensive project, and individual citizens aren't expected to take that on their personal finances. And when we look at reducing our energy consumption in our homes to reduce emissions, part of that is an energy infrastructure project, because we realize that building up our electricity capacity to support everything in order to be zero emissions is a huge project. So we need to reduce. But somewhere in that math, it's ended up that homeowners should be responsible for taking that on. And that's quite challenging. So one of the approaches that is suggested is to approach this project as an energy infrastructure project, where homeowners are funded in some way or another to do these retrofits, recognizing that that is building our national or provincial infrastructure. And then, of course, for those of you who have homes and have the resources to actually take these steps and the interest, early adopters are incredibly helpful. And some of you I already know on this call are early adopters. So if you have the interest and the capacity to take these steps, to electrify your home, to insulate your home, to act as an example of what is possible, then that's a great way to take action. So that's it. So I just want to, I hope that I've managed to convey some of what the obstacles are, and also some of the hope and the direction that we can go to encourage the retrofit economy and some of the benefits that we can get out of it. So I'm looking forward to hearing some questions and interacting with all of you. Thank you.
Sharon, thank you so much for an incredibly complete and thoughtful and complex assessment of the challenges ahead for our economy and our homes. We have a number of questions on the chat box here, and I think Art will let people in when it's their turn to speak. The first was Jeff Passmore had to leave early, but he made the comment about electric space heating, electrical resistant space heating as being inefficient, not heat pumps, which are another matter. And the next person up is Susan Tanner. And Susan, are you there? Art, are you there?
Yeah, she's coming.
Okay. She wants to know if there's work going on in water reuse. Why flush drinking water down the drain?
Here she comes. And who's after her? We got to get them coming.
Yeah, okay.
Right, so she's on the call? It's good. Yes, okay.
Martin
Yeah.
Riddle.
Okay, sorry about that.
Yeah,
I got
that's
Oh, Jean Dawkins.
my fingers weren't operating right there.
Jean Doherty.
enough.
Is there anything coming up about water?
Yeah, so that's actually a great question. And in some of the versions of this presentation, I talk about it a little bit. so one of the energy reasons for water conservation and using gray water systems and so forth is that a huge amount of energy goes into purifying our water. So we talk about that often, of how we spend an enormous amount of money purifying our water, and then we fill up our pools with it and we water our gardens, and that's a real expense on the infrastructure. It is part of residential retrofits. It's not the focus of the work that we do, because we're looking at emissions reduction directly connected to the home, but it is relevant. And so, yes, there are technologies out there that allow recapture of gray water and reuse. And for what I'm seeing, and I'm not an expert in this area, so if someone on this call is, feel free to jump in. But I'm seeing more interest in that in larger buildings, so in corporate buildings and manufacturing settings. But there certainly are some early adopters who are doing that in their own homes. And I think as we get through some of these more obvious retrofits, that stuff is going to become more popular.
Thank you. It was a great presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Jean?
Thank you, Sharon. That was an absolutely wonderful presentation. In my question, what I had said was, how do you find a contractor that would be able to do an installation for something like a heat pump? And I'm speaking personally, but in general, are there people who are being trained for installing heat pumps? Air source heat pumps in particular is what I'm thinking about. But also, how do we find, because this is all new equipment, this is all new technology that I don't know that much about, how do I know that I'm getting a good deal, and how do I go about finding somebody that would be reliable to do that work?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and that's actually one of the things that we're looking at addressing. So the simplest answer to that is that an HVAC company would theoretically be able to install a heat pump, and some of them can, and some of them are trained to do so. If anybody on the call has tried to buy a heat pump and have it installed in Ottawa recently, you'll know that it's not very easy. There's long wait lists. It's hard to find somebody who can install and actually has the availability, and that is one of the things that we need to address in terms of how do you find that contractor. That's a conversation that's happening right now between us and the City of Ottawa, and we're aiming to make that part of the Better Homes Ottawa site. We're not exactly sure how that's going to work. So there are different approaches to that. So one possible approach is that you develop a certification that contractors have to go through in order to be recommended as a contractor on the official City of Ottawa website, or City of Calgary, or wherever you are. It looks like that might be the approach that will be taken. So it's not requiring that contractors do this training, because for a variety of reasons that's considered to be going too far, but it is pulling out contractors that have taken the time to do that training, that we can basically guarantee they really understand the mechanics, they know what to do here, and featuring them. And so you would be able to go, once we launch that site, to the site and click on a list of contractors that are recommended for that reason. And so that's one possible approach, but actually you're identifying one of the barriers, that's hard to do, and there isn't anywhere to go for that. So what you could do in the immediate is you could actually call EnviroCentre and talk to one of our staff, and we know people. There are other organizations that do too, but that's not very efficient. Not everybody wants to do that, and so we are trying to build better supports.
Because especially if somebody is wanting to replace their furnace for whatever reason, age and whatever, they're not going to put out that kind of money and then a few years later try and do a deep retrofit. It's the sort of thing that, if you're in the process of doing it now, there needs to be some resources there immediately. But thank you for that idea. Yeah, no, you're right. And also the knowledge. So that's very important, that if somebody does replace their furnace, so somebody out there in the city is replacing their gas furnace right now, well, that's locked in for, at least 15 years. And it might be that the incentives will be good enough in 10 years, and that the culture will have changed around it, so somebody would actually be proactive about it. But that's really what we're trying to avoid, because the gains of installing a heat pump when you have to change over your system, particularly if you need to change out your air conditioner, but certainly if you're replacing your furnace and your air conditioner, there's a great cost case for that. That is the time to do it, and there are ways to do it. And if you want to, you should call us, because we know how to do it, and then we have some studies that we can walk you through. But you're absolutely right. If you don't catch people at that moment, it's too late. Thank you. Okay.
Oh, Martin Riddle next, and then Rick Carpenter.
Yeah, Sharon, great presentation. Thank you. a question. What about new builds? I mean, I understand you're focused on retrofitting, but it seems to me with the amount of construction going on and I live in Toronto, new builds is obviously the place to go given the cost of retrofitting. So what about new builds? Where do we stand relative to efficiency in those areas?
Yeah, so I must admit I'm not the world's leading expert on new builds. We do work a little bit in that area, but I can give you a bit of an overview that one of the reasons that EnviroCentre as a nonprofit organization is focusing on retrofits is that at this point there isn't really any good money in it. It's a good place for a nonprofit to be supporting that type of work. In new builds, there is, and so there are some really exciting project developments being built in Ottawa, I know there's a big one in London, all across the country really, that are using new technologies, even building to passive house standards. In some ways, it's a bit easier to incentivize that because there's a good sell associated with it. But sort of an answer to your question, when you're looking at new builds, very similar dynamics apply. A really important one just being building code and what's actually required. So if we can get to a place where the building code is requiring that you meet, I'm just going to go all the way, say passive house standard if you're building a new home or you're building a large building, we're talking about that, and there is work happening on the ground to move in that direction, but we're not quite there yet. And that's probably the strongest tool in that area, because then that just becomes the market. It transforms the market. The same can apply to retrofits. You can have a retrofit code that requires, when you're doing a retrofit, you must also do this, and you must retrofit to this particular level. We don't have that yet, but that is one of the things that we're pushing towards as well.
Sharon, who's the lead in Toronto for this?
For home retrofits?
Yes.
Excellent
Center in
question.
Toronto.
So we've been working with, there's a number of community projects that are trying to roll out deep retrofits. We've been working with the Clean Air Partnership, and to a lesser extent with the Toronto Atmospheric Fund. They don't focus as much on residential unless it's large residential. I would say that the best resource there probably is the Clean Air Partnership, and of course Better Homes Toronto. So that is a city program, and there's a lot of information on that site, and they curate all of the approaches to retrofits in Toronto. So they would be a good place to go for information.
Thank you.
Okay, Rick Carpenter, and then on deck, Peggy Atherton.
Sharon, just a wonderful presentation, and Martin has already begun the line of questioning that I want to follow about new builds. But I was just going to say, your presentation really should be given to every homeowner in Ottawa, and I'm sure that is your wish, your hope. And you probably have a pretty good handle on how best to do that. TV Ontario, getting Payton to interview you would be very nice, but that's not just Ottawa. But these ideas should be in the minds of all homeowners. They should also be in the minds of all contractors. And there would be a cross feed, of course, between new builds, which have to reflect standards that would be set in the building code to make all homes environmentally sound. It's not as though this idea has been around for a short time. My cousin, Stephen Carpenter, built a firm called Intermodal some years ago in Waterloo that was based entirely on building homes that you almost didn't have to heat them because they were so efficient. And that was years ago. So it's been around, and what puzzles me is that it hasn't just become the standard. And I'm wondering what the reason for that is. You hinted at it because in the beginning, energy costs have been so cheap. Maybe we should do something about that.
Yeah, so that's one reason. Actually, in some ways, that's a big one, especially in Ontario. In larger buildings, one of the dynamics is that the market doesn't value energy efficiency the way it should. So if you built, for instance, a set of condos that are built to passive standard, you're going to have to pay more to build those condos. It will be a more expensive build, and you may not be able to recoup that because people don't value that in a buy as much as they should. So even if they're saving huge amounts of energy and that'll actually reduce their costs, and there's all kinds of positive things associated, the market as it stands today, as far as I know, values other things more. So people would rather have other luxury items in their home. It's the invisibility of energy efficiency. It's not, you know, we always say it's not very sexy. The word retrofit is not very interesting. It makes everybody fall asleep. We would like to find a new word for it, and maybe we will. So that's a bit of the problem there, that the market, you can't make the kind of profit that you would expect from making that sort of investment. But I do think that you've really hit the nail on the head there, that one of the issues there is the cheap price of fossil fuel energy, especially in Ontario.
And thus a carbon tax would be helpful in this regard. An increasing amount of tax as the years go by, that every homeowner realizes.
Yeah, so that's the simplest economic argument, that we can then see the cost reflected in our prices. Obviously in Canada, despite the fact that we have a carbon tax, it's a very contentious issue. So there are other possible approaches, but yes, in the perfect world, that would be a good approach.
Oh, Peggy.
Thank you very much.
And back again to Martin Riddle.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation, Sharon. I imagine you must know the Ottawa Renewable Energy Cooperative.
Yes.
Can you, they have put solar panels on some schools and low cooperative housing and government buildings, and also Indigenous communities. I imagine that they would be a good source of information for contractors.
Yes, yeah, so they are, and they are one of our partners in this project. We work with them quite regularly. Actually, we work more with the co-energy arm. So, and yes, they do have lots of good information for contractors. They're probably not the leader in that area. So one of our other partners is the Greater Ottawa Home Builders Association. So trying to work with them to really get directly in with contractors. Co-energy and OREC are doing a lot of amazing work. They really shy away from residential because of the financing model. It doesn't work as well for small residential. And so we've been actually trying for years to figure out a way that we can actively partner on a project, and we haven't really been able to get there because of the financing rules that apply to the cooperative. But yes, they're a great partner in terms of information, and also kind of disseminating information throughout the community, because many of the investors in co-energy and OREC are folks like you who are seriously invested in making progress in this area, and so they've done a lot of work there too.
I find it very difficult persuading people to undertake projects on their own, for instance, putting solar panels up, or even buying a energy efficient vehicle. So I think I had difficulty there, but
well, I think that harkens back to the earlier question, or the comment that, you know, all homeowners should watch this presentation. So I guess from EnviroCentre's perspective, we would say absolutely not, because they would get so bored. So we have other presentations that kind of simplify it and bring it in practical terms. But the reality is, I don't think we can expect the majority of residents of Ottawa or anywhere else to be really excited about this stuff. It needs to be communicated in a different way, and the incentives need to be good enough so that the person who's raising 5 kids on one income in a house somewhere in Ottawa, who cannot make this their top priority, has a good reason to move forward. Because it's really exciting to talk to groups like this where people are excited about this type of stuff, but we do not represent the majority, and we don't have to. We have to find ways to communicate with the community that moves this work forward without having to make everybody an environmentalist, I think.
Okay, Martin again, and then Art Hunter.
I've asked my question, Paul, thank you.
You want me to read it to you?
Oh, okay.
No, I've got Art's up here. I have to go back to get yours.
Sorry, Martin, did you say you'd already asked your question?
I did ask a question. While I have you, Sharon, I'm going to put you in contact with Leaside community here in Toronto. It's a community about 50 years old. A lot of renovation is going on in the community, new houses and retrofits to houses. There's a lot of money in that community. People are driving a couple of cars. Seems to me that an article in their newsletter might be very useful. So I'll be in contact with you and put you in contact with the people that run that newsletter.
That would be great. Thank you.
No problem. Thank you.
I didn't
Great
find the
presentation.
question, so I'll turn it over to Art, and then after Art is Peter Menke.
Okay. I guess I'm one of the few people who's been an early adopter. I've been at this for 5 years, and in the process, I have given over 130 tours to 600 people. I've heard the I can't afford it argument so many times that this is a primary concern on everyone's mind, as if for whatever magical reason they figured I had all that money sitting loosely in my pocket. No, I had to go and borrow the money. I considered the money an investment, not a cost, because it has definitely a return on investment. It means I am not buying natural gas. I am not buying gasoline because I drive an EV. I got 2 of them now. It means that I'm not buying electricity. In fact, I'm selling electricity into the grid. There are other things to consider. Yes, I know the real estate world has yet to recognize value in having or being a microgrid or part of a distributed energy resource, but I'm sure that's going to change with time, particularly as the cost of energy from whatever source goes up, and as that energy infrastructure gets disrupted, as has happened in Texas, as we saw, and has happened with the ice storm and other things locally, that there is ongoing stresses that are going to get people's attention, which brings up this whole world of recognition of the value of survival, recognition of the value of resilience. I know this recent power outage that we had locally here, where 6,000 homes were off just last week for 8 hours, that people were knocking on my door saying my water pressure from the well has gone down. Can we plug our well into your system, which I did, and they got water back. Is that of some value? Well, I think it's of some value. Interestingly, the other things that started to happen was people wanted from that aren't on my community well, they were coming around with buckets because they needed water to flush toilets, and others were looking for potable water. People were coming up and saying, can I plug my cell phone in? I'm addressing the good neighbor world. Is that of some value? Should that somehow be included in the reasons why people should go into debt? Now, I also think it's important to say that yes, I went into debt, and I am now clear of it. I've paid the whole lot off. Now, I want to make the point that I don't function in a world that says, today I did not buy $3 worth of gasoline, therefore I'm going to put $3 in the kitty. That is not the way it works. That's not the way most people do their finances. What I do is I say, oh dear, look at my bank account. I'm not spending money on this energy infrastructure. I'm going to take that and buy down my line of credit. And not only that, income is coming from other sources. I do not try and separate my income as coming from savings and that from working with clients or whatever, or pension income. I don't work that way, and I don't know anybody else who does. You buy down debt to get rid of it. And, and I keep telling people who come through here that I have, you know, an awful embarrassment that has come up at the end of 3 years after I paid down that debt. I'm still getting that cash flow of money I'm not spending. And by the way, it's not taxable. You know, it's a dividend that the government can't tax me on because it's money I didn't spend. And so I found another way to solve that excess of riches. I went and bought a Tesla Model 3 and that solved that embarrassment. In any event, have you in fact given this concept of what's going to happen in the future? If somebody was to do a deep retrofit now and they put some and become a distributed energy resource or a microgrid, and they have things included like vehicle to grid connections and how this all gets integrated through aggregation into the national grid, or at least the provincial grid. I mean, these things are happening. They're happening in California. They're happening in Europe. They're happening even in New York. They're happening around the world. They just haven't happened yet in Ontario. That doesn't mean they're not going to happen. We're only talking about when. And I would suggest that perhaps this might be something you might want to include in your presentation in terms of value. Anyway, any comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that idea of being a good neighbor as being an incentive is a really interesting one. So I wouldn't say that I've done a lot of thinking around that. The resilience bit, yes. So I think resilience over the next number of years and even right now, because the reality of the pandemic over the last year and a half has really increased people's attention to the idea of resilience. It's a very different crisis, but it brings up the same kinds of things. And so I think people are starting to prioritize that more. I think a lot of people are already well aware of some of the risks inherent in our system. So they're not risks that we think about every day, but you know, one thing for Canadians and folks in Ottawa, or even more so folks in Gatineau, we're really one city where lots of the energy is electric. If that goes out, which the electricity does go out in Gatineau on a fairly regular basis, and it's -30, that's pretty scary. And so it does get you thinking about things like backup batteries and solar power and how can I build resilience. And we haven't really cracked that nut on what the communications approach is to that. But that's something that we'll be considering as we move forward in this project. And I do like that idea of kind of telling the story of what is possible when you do this kind of retrofit and how you can support your neighbors and how you do have more resiliency. I mean, I was listening to you talk, Art, and I was thinking really we should be making a transcript so that we can just share this as a case study of a story that worked, because that's a great story of saying, you know, I'm not rolling in money. I went into debt to do this. And it's an easier case to make now because it seriously does look like the Canada Infrastructure Bank, or no, sorry, CMHC, my acronyms, I always confuse, are going to release zero interest loans for energy retrofits up to $40,000. And that's really helpful. And then the city of Ottawa here in Ottawa is probably going to have to match that with the Better Homes Loan Program, because nobody's going to want a loan that isn't zero interest when you can get it from somewhere else. And that does change the circumstance. And so we have to adjust what our communications are to match that. So I will take that away and think about it. And I'll also revisit your interview with Mandy and see if we can get any transcripts out of that.
Okay, Peter Menke and then Peter Bolkowski.
Oh, hi. Thanks. A great presentation, Sharon. I have been urging the government to change its regulations on borrowing from RIFs and RRSPs and TFSAs. They do allow you to borrow some money to do some even purchasing a house or going to school. But why don't they let you borrow money from your capital? Because capital is key to an awful lot of these things to do some retrofitting. You are paying back yourself when you pay back the interest rate and so on. So it has a very good incentive to go ahead with this. It helps reduce the financing program, but I don't know why we've approached they've been approached about doing this, but it hasn't appeared in any budget so far.
Yeah, that's interesting. My guess would be, and I'm not an authority on that, is that could well happen. Folks are looking at and working very hard on rolling out different types of financing tools, and it wouldn't surprise me at all if that eventually came down the pipeline. It takes the federal government a really long time, as everyone knows, to process these ideas and weigh them against all the other things they're doing. But that would fit into the overall agenda. What I don't know is whether other approaches to financing had been demonstrated to be more effective, so they may be focusing on that at this point. There are folks in Ottawa that are really, in fact, there's one pillar of the Ottawa Energy Collective that focuses on financing and really retrofit financing, and so they may have done some work into that sort of thing, but I'm not completely clear on that, unfortunately.
Thanks.
Okay, where is Peter Bukowski? Is he there?
I'm here, Peter Bulkowski here. From what I've heard of the presentation and the various feedbacks, you're a nonprofit. You do not depend upon government to keep you funded, but your entire program is dependent upon government funding in one fashion or another to scale the deep retrofits. So basically, the entire program ultimately is dependent upon a financially able government with spare cash to provide to this. Is that correct?
So in this model, the case that I've been making is that that's the most obvious path forward. It's not the only possible direction. So many folks are looking at other financing solutions and other approaches. So actually, Art was giving an example in the conversation before we started of, I don't know if I want to bring this into the conversation, but of BlackRock financing an approach to residential retrofits. There are other options. So this is the view from today and what we think would be one possible path forward. Yeah, so I don't want to say yes, it absolutely requires government funding. What we have seen in Canada so far is that to make progress in that area, it usually does require incentives or some degree of public funding. So we'll see how that plays out. This next round could be different, but that seems quite likely.
Okay, Dave Doherty and then Ted Manning.
Sorry. Okay, so you've touched on a number of barriers to homeowners. You touched a little bit on barriers, I suppose, to builders, but I have a question regarding the overall envelope at the highest levels of which you can think. What are the barriers? Really, we're talking, what are the political barriers? And who is presenting those barriers? Because yes, I understand your comment about being in the government and the government taking a long time, but I have seen, and we have very recent experience with the government reacting very fast, days in fact, in the pandemic. When new information came along, they said, right, let's go buy those vaccines. Mm-hmm. It took days.
Yeah,
It does not have to take years.
no, you're absolutely right. And that's been an argument that's been rolled out quite a lot as an illustration of why it should be possible for us to mobilize very quickly to address climate change and reduce emissions. You know, the short answer to that, I would say, is that yes, it is politics. So climate is not the same ballpark as healthcare, at least not right now. And you know, there's lots of interesting approaches to that. So one example of great progress in the area of climate action has been to recognize what are some of the key flashpoints for the government that they will act on. So for instance, in Ontario, the single biggest emissions reduction in Ontario was closing of the coal plants. And we've basically been riding the coattails of that for years since that happened. And one of the big reasons why that happened is that there was a healthcare argument for it, that you would save money in terms of healthcare if you took that action. And so folks were able to move forward. And so I'm not sure what the tie-in could be there. I mean, there are some tie-ins to residential retrofits. They're maybe not quite as dramatic as pollution from coal plants. I do think that that's a political difference. And climate is still a really contentious political issue here in Canada. We're seeing a little bit of a shift there, but as long as the two main parties can differentiate themselves by pro-climate action and not pro-climate action, then we have a problem in terms of moving forward in policy.
Well, I'm very interested that you brought up healthcare, because I spent a number of years at Health Canada, and I can tell you that we lose hundreds of thousands of people to air pollution. Let's ignore all the other aspects of fossil fuels with respect to climate change. We lose hundreds of thousands of people to air pollution every year. And we're doing essentially nothing about it. In fact, there are people in our organization who have, for a very long time, just been appalled at various levels of government doing things like getting rid of air pollution monitors. As if we just don't know how bad the air pollution is, we'll feel better and not have heart attacks.
Yeah, and arguably those are some of the creative approaches, or you could also say just integrated approaches to looking at asking folks to engage with environmental pollution, with climate change, tying them into some of the other co-benefits that are associated with eliminating pollution, and tying them into the things that folks already care about and already feel as tangible in their lives, because it's not hard to do. There's, you know, the things that are harmed by climate change, that are harmed by pollution, are the things that matter to us. We just have to choose the right narrative. And I think that's it. Generally speaking, I would say that the climate movement hasn't had resounding success in choosing that narrative. It's been hard to do. Obviously, there has been progress made anyway, but in terms of going to the next level, it may be that we need another narrative that links climate change and emissions reduction to some of the things that we hold dearest.
Okay, Ted.
Yeah, do you suppose we can get anybody to actually invest in their own future? The Art came up with a very good notion, which is essentially an investment that brings you and your neighbors benefits. Almost every day on TV, I see stars on there telling me that I can borrow half the value of my house because I'm over 55 years old, and I can invest it in anything I want. Everything from art to visits to unsalubrious places. Why would I not then be able to borrow that money against myself to put a solar roof on my house, or to do what Art has done? I've never seen it marketed that way. They're always talking about how I can increase my luxury and not necessarily my security in my future. Mm-hmm. So on that basic comment, I'm talking about maybe a slightly different tack on how we try to advertise the future to people. And I think that's another thing that I think KCOR and the Club of Rome might want to focus on, which is how to inspire people to actually consider the future. That said, I put two things that the KCOR has already done as building blocks. They're in this chat, so I won't bother going through them. But simply to say that they are to provide tactics to individuals to understand what is possible, where the risks are, and also to a program that is now renovating all of Canada's building codes, province by province and city by city, led by NRC, to reflect climate change risk more effectively in all of those codes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, this is a great conversation, because it's always interesting to hear different folks talking about what would be a good communications approach around some of these issues, and how we could encourage different groups of people to actually join in and choose to take action. So thank you. That's really interesting.
I just want to make a comment that it's the question of saying, should I plan for a disaster during the disaster or after the disaster? How about planning before the disaster? What a novel thought.
Art, and looking at the questions going down here now, it seems that ones after people saying what a great job Sharon did, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not sure if I see any burning question left.
Okay, why don't we then wind it up? Would you like to thank Sharon, please?
Yeah, Sharon, I know you put a lot of effort into this, and what a great presentation, a lot of food for thought for everybody. It isn't going to get resolved overnight, that's for sure. But with somebody like you at the helm, EnviroCentre continues to have a good future. So well done.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to be here.